International Media TV. Television that listens to you.
Hi, I'm Johnnie Burrell. Welcome to the program.
Welcome to the San Francisco Bay Area.
Thank you.
I didn't bring a list of questions because I like the idea of having a candid conversation. And I want to begin with asking you, as a child, when was the first time you realized that your father was different?
Well, I don't know when the exact point was, but because there were people in and out of our home all the time, who were sometimes prominent and well-known, some actors like Harry Belafonte or entertainers, as well as people like Julian Bond, Stokely Carmichael, and John Lewis. Certainly back then didn't totally understand who they were, but knew that what he and his team were doing was important to bringing about a transformation in our society. So I probably was, 7, 8, or 9, and then I also traveled with my father maybe 7 or 8 times. And oftentimes when we traveled, it was my dad, Dr. Abernathy, and several of his lieutenants. And so in the context of travel, I had an opportunity to see him interact with people from all walks of life. So I knew that he was doing something significant. I can't say that I understood at that time, but I knew something.
But you knew something something's up.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
I want to, a lot of people, when they think of your father, they talk about the speech, the dream. And I want to talk about the dream in a different way. Do you think, and some of us, and I'm one of those people, think that sometimes the focus is too much on the dream? And words have power, we know that. And so what has happened is that the focus has been so much on the dream, there at some point was never a real awakening where we as black folk did what we could do for ourselves to make things happen. And I think so much of his message, if not the core of his message was to be self-supportive and not just to dream, but to wake up. How do you respond to that? Certainly I'm not suggesting that the dream should not have been some or part of what he talked about, but it can take away from what really needs to be done.
Well, I think, number one, you really have to become a student of who Martin King Jr. was, and he's astute enough to also listen to the entire message of I Have a Dream, because he started off talking about a check that had been waged and sent to the National Treasury, but that check came back marked insufficient funds. That was probably the true essence and revolutionary part of Martin Luther King Jr., but the media wanted to focus on the dream part.
Right, and then, that's my point. You're absolutely right.
So that's why it's incumbent upon us to do our own research and get to really listen to the speech in its entirety, and to look at other messages that he delivered. Because, when you think about in 1955, there was the Montgomery bus boycott, and people organized for 381 days, didn't ride the buses of Montgomery. And then you had the sit-ins in the 60s and the freedom rides in the early 60s, which created, after Birmingham, the Climate for Civil Rights Act in 1964. And then you had the march from Selma to Montgomery, and those several marches that created the right to vote, and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And then you had, right after Dad was killed, fair housing legislation was passed. So Dad and his team had a public policy plan, not just a plan of demonstrating and just trying to get things. They had really a strategic plan, and they worked on an issue until it was complete, then they moved to the next one. The unfortunate part is, in our nation today, our problems are so vast that we'll start on a problem, but we don't finish.
Right, don't finish, absolutely.
And then we'll go to something else. And so we've got to figure out, how do we stay focused on an issue until we get what we want for our community, and then move to the next issue. And that's why I talk about a strategic plan. But I don't think we've even, most people, even in our history books, you've got a couple of pages of history, of black history, about Martin Luther King. And while that's okay, there's so many individuals who've been significant in African American history that our children need to know about. And you almost have to immerse yourself even in Martin Luther King to understand him. We take phrases like "by any means necessary" and put that on Malcolm X as if that's all he personified. Right. That was something that he said, but there was so much more to what Malcolm X represented, and he continued to evolve as just as all. And so many leaders were cut down in their prime. Certainly Medgar Evers in '63, and I mean, there were a number of others, as we lost President Kennedy in '63, of course, and then, of course, '68, Dad and Robert Kennedy, and Malcolm in '65. So, I mean, we lost a lot of. The '60s was a very challenging decade. We lost leaders that our whole world would be totally different had those leaders lived.
Absolutely.
So the question becomes today, how do we address some of these issues? Now, one of the things that exist that I think we've got to find a way to capitalize upon is social media, because that is where our young people live.
Yeah.
And whether it's texting, whether it's Instagramming, whether it's all those different modalities, Facebook. I mean, this is how you reach masses of people.
It's a new day with regard to media.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, your point about the media telling the story that they told mostly was about the dream. And it's important that we have our own measuring stick. So given that, right now we know that there are no full-power television stations in this country. And when the church talks more with regard to the check that wasn't cashed versus the dream, do you think there can be more of a conversation about what did get done or what we need to get done, even if we don't talk about the dream?
Well, I certainly think that the short answer is yes, that we could, in my judgment, the church has to really be a headlight and not a tail light. And some of our churches are still operating from a tail light perspective. But the headlight perspective also deals with the entire person, not just the spiritual needs. You have to deal with the social, the physical. I mean, all these different needs. That's what the church has to do to be relevant. And then the other thing the church has to do is find a way to incorporate to embrace men, because what the way that we even portray Jesus in the Christian tradition is not the best way. I mean, Jesus was revolutionary, and that's not how he really taught in our church. He was just docile. He was just and so
passive even.
Right. That's right. And that's
and that was not the case.
So until we get that right, our churches are full of significant numbers of our churches have a lot of women, but our men are not there. So we got to immerse, I think, ourselves, and our churches have to do a better job of leading the way.
Absolutely.
And when that happens, I think we will begin to see major changes throughout our community. Well, that's one of the things. The other thing is I constantly talk about corralling capital. You can't continue to blame somebody totally when you're spending $1 trillion.
Right.
Well, we ain't got no money. You're right.
You have money.
Individually, we may not, but collectively, we are spending $1 trillion.
Absolutely.
Now, the problem is it's not structured properly. So most money, in many communities, money circulates 8 or 9 times before it goes out. In our community, it comes in and then it goes back out. And that's how we address that, that's probably one of the biggest challenges we got to figure out. How do we keep dollars circulating in our community? Because quite frankly, if we manage this $1 trillion, or even if we manage 100 billion of it,
fraction
of it, 100 billion
yeah,
of it,
sure.
10%. If we manage 10%,
we can begin to get things done.
We can create jobs for people, opportunity, all kind of things.
Well, one of the things I see, at least I think, I see there's a real separation in the black community with if you're a professional or not, if you went to college and had a degree or not. And so many people who, Bill Gates, for example, did go to college. The Apple, iPod.
Steve Jobs.
Steve Jobs.
Yeah.
And it goes on, that there's a real kind of a school, like you don't invite the 7th graders to the 9th grade dance. We do a lot of that, which I think keeps us from building and having and prospering. And it's interesting that you alluded to the men and families. What babies who are born addicted and malnourished, and men who are absent, how do you go about getting black community to see that we need to embrace young black boys and men to be there and get rid of the notion that they don't want to be there?
When you just don't want
to be there for their families,
for
having created a child.
Yeah. Well, I think the biggest unintended consequence of President Obama. You know what it is?
Tell me.
I'm listening.
You don't run for office for this, but every day, blacks and whites and Latinos, Native Americans, Asian, see a president that's married with black children. Every day, every week, they're seeing it. So our children are subliminally now being programmed to say, I want to be like that. I want to have a family. So where we, at one time, society has created barriers so that black men had to leave home. And this is not to make an excuse. You check if a black man is there, you're not going to get the mess. So it was real.
And she has to support her family, and you do what you need to do.
So, but I'm saying there's one of the biggest unintended consequences of the president is going to be that. That's going to be because for 8 years, black children have seen something that we historically don't see, because in their own situations, for whatever reason, they may say, well, that doesn't exist. But you know what? That's what I aspire for, and that's what that's how I want to set my life, my life. Now, the other things that we all have to figure out is how we get a cadre. And when I say a cadre, in every city, there are thousands of black men. We need to find a way to get, 10,000 men in 10 communities mentoring consistently. So you have some who may be sanitation workers, some who may be lawyers, some who may be teachers, some who may be.
They're not all professional.
Just every. But the goal is to see the men who've been absent are now taking responsibility. Right. Some of that we've seen in some communities, but we need to find a way to create, I said 10 cities, but it may be 50. But the fact is, if we started with 3 to 5, we would begin to see changes dramatically throughout our community.
Yeah. Well, we need to, I think part of what I'm hearing from you is that your father with the dream and all of the plans that he laid out, seems to me that you are the awakening. Not entirely, but I'm glad to hear that your focus hasn't only entirely been on his work, but to only talk about his work, acknowledge his work, and also acknowledges that there are things that we have to do, and not everything doesn't have to do with racism in terms of where we are. That there's a lot more responsibility
we have to take.
That we have to do.
No question.
I'm very happy to hear that, Reverend.
Well, no question. I think
because we have to do well in spite of what people do. And I love what you said about the over yonder. That the church needs to talk a little less about over yonder when we get there, and what are we going to do here. Love it.
And by the way, I was saying to Paul Cobb, I don't think this matters. We came to this conclusion.
Or it might matter.
No. What I'm getting ready to say, I was saying to him, well, I'm actually not a minister, not in terms of a traditional sense. I don't have a church, and I'm not ordained. However, I have a ministry, which is the work that I'm involved in, because that's basically what ministering is, teaching. on the one hand, and subconsciously, since I am not ordained, there's a little there's a minister club of folk that certain things you can do because you're minister, but I come to the conclusion that I don't think that's as important anymore. I think it was certainly, if you look at my dad's team, you had Dr. Abernathy, a minister. He had Andrew Young, a minister around. He had Wyatt T. Walker, a minister. I mean, a lot of the guys, and that's just some of them, but many of them were ministers or became. Sure. And I think that was appropriate, but I don't know that that's all. I don't believe that's all you must manifest today.
Absolutely.
That's important,
it's important,
but it doesn't have to just be all.
Yeah. Your last word.
My last word. Let me think. Someone asked me what are lessons that your mom and dad taught you, and I said they taught me to love myself, to have a love of my family, to have a love of our community, and to have the love of God. So, love of self, love of family, love of community, love of God. That formula has worked for me because, you really can't truly love others until you love yourself. And it's so important that we love our families, even though sometimes we have challenges with our families. And then you got to love your community. When you love your community, then you don't accept poverty. You don't accept the many things that plague our community.
Sure.
And obviously it all comes from having the love of God.
Thank you very much.
All right. Okay. Thank you.
Thanks.